So we've just navigated Descartes' own intricate map of mind and body. But how did others react? Let's start with Pierre Daniel Huet. This guy wasn't just a critic, he was a walking embodiment of philosophical skepticism, tracing its lineage right back to the ancient Greeks. Interestingly, he managed to juggle this skeptical stance in philosophy with a rather firm faith in religion, a classic 17th century balancing act. Now, when it came to Descartes, we saw him not as a revolutionary genius, but as something of a poseur. Think of it like a magician who claims to have invented card tricks while secretly using a borrowed deck. Huet argued Descartes' big claim to fame, being the first to build philosophy on solid ground, was undermined by his feigned ignorance of what came before. It was a performance, Huet suggested, designed to make Descartes look more original than he actually was. And Huet wasn't shy about listing these alleged debts, borrowing doubt from the skeptics, the cogito from Augustine, the ontological argument from Anselm. The list goes on. He basically accused Descartes of either outright plagiarism or, at the very least, pulling a fast one by not giving credit where it was due. Forget the excuse that footnotes weren't common back then. Huet thought Descartes was doing something ethically questionable. Now, besides the academic squabbles about originality, Huet had a much more pressing concern. Descartes' philosophy was, in his eyes, a direct threat to the Catholic faith. He couldn't ignore Descartes' public declarations of respect for church teachings, but he saw through what he perceived as a dangerous arrogance. Huet argued that Descartes had it backwards. The proper approach, according to Huet, would have been to take the established Catholic dogmas as fundamental truths and then build a philosophy around them. Instead, Descartes flipped the script. He treated his own philosophical conclusions as the bedrock of certainty, and then tried to bend Catholic doctrine to fit his pre-existing system. It's like trying to force a square peg into a round hole, but with potentially explosive consequences for religious belief. Huet specifically pointed fingers at Descartes' handling of tricky doctrines like transubstantiation, the idea that bread and wine can become the actual body and blood of Christ during Mass, and creation ex nihilo, creating things out of nothing. These weren't just abstract theological points. They were battlegrounds where Huet believed Descartes' rationalism clashed head-on with established doctrine. So, how did Huet diagnose Descartes' motivation for introducing this peculiar doctrine of the eternal truths, the idea that mathematical and logical truths were created by God alongside the world? Huet's diagnosis is quite sharp. He argued that Descartes essentially put himself in the driver's seat, setting up his own intellect as the ultimate arbiter of what constitutes reason. But then, inevitably, Catholic dogmas like transubstantiation popped up, things that didn't quite align with Descartes' intuitive grasp of reason. What did Descartes do? According to Huet, he panicked slightly and inferred that God must be capable of doing things that are not just beyond our understanding, but perhaps even contrary to reason itself. Think about that implication. If God can violate reason, what's left of rational inquiry? Huet's counter-argument was devastatingly simple. Why not flip the assumption? Why not accept as an axiom that Catholic dogmas are necessarily aligned with reason? If you take that stance, Huet argued, you'd be forced to conclude that your own philosophical intuitions, however strong trivial, cannot be the final word on what is truly rational. It's a neat reversal that puts the brakes on Descartes' epistemological ambitions. Huet's critique, as detailed in his work Censura Cartesiana, wasn't just about theological clashes and accusations of plagiarism. He also offered a deep dive into the philosophy itself, viewed through a skeptical lens. Here's where it gets interesting. Unlike some other critics who outright rejected methodic doubt, Huet actually saw it as a positive step. For him, this was one of the good bits of Descartes' philosophy. But, and it's a big but, Huet criticized Descartes for not following through consistently. Descartes set up this strict rule: don't believe anything unless you're absolutely certain. Sounds great, right? But then, almost immediately, Descartes starts accepting things that are merely probable, or even admits later that some of his initial assumptions might be false. It's like saying, I only eat food I know for sure is safe, and then grabbing a sandwich you saw someone else eat. Huet also threw a wrench into the famous cogito ergo sum. He argued that Descartes hadn't actually proven it was indubitable. Why? Because, as one commentator puts it, it's not just an immediate awareness, it's an inference. There's a tiny gap between the act of thinking and the realization, ah, I am thinking. And what if that memory of thinking was faulty? Even the seemingly rock-solid foundation cracks under scrutiny. Now, when we talk about Huet's philosophical critique, we can't help but notice the shadow of another prominent critic, Pierre Gassendi. Some scholars argue Huet was heavily reliant on Gassendi, maybe even a bit too much. But even if it's an exaggeration, it's undeniable that they often found themselves on the same page, targeting many of the same aspects of Descartes' thought. Take, for instance, Descartes' claim to be casting off all previous beliefs. Both Huet and Gassendi pointed out the absurdity of this. Rejecting all past opinions isn't doubt. It's adopting a new, highly questionable belief that all old beliefs are false, especially since some of those old beliefs were likely true. It's like deciding to reject every single historical fact you ever learned because you want to start fresh. Beyond this specific point, both thinkers launched broad empiricist attacks against Descartes' ideas of innate ideas, the notion that we're born with knowledge pre-installed, and the idea that the mind is inherently better known than the body. The fascinating part here is the contrast. Huet, the conservative defender of tradition, and Gassendi, a champion of modern mechanistic science, could find so much common ground in critiquing Descartes. This highlights how problematic Descartes' system appeared to many, regardless of their own philosophical leanings. Let's shift gears to Henry More, a Cambridge Platonist whose story is particularly dramatic. Imagine this: More was once one of Descartes' closest correspondents and ardent admirers. Fast forward a bit, and he becomes one of the philosopher's most vocal and bitter enemies. Scholars have puzzled over this dramatic apostasy. Was it a complete philosophical U-turn? Not really. More's core philosophical reservations about Descartes, like his discomfort with defining matter solely by extension, or his early opposition to the beast-machine idea, seem to have been consistent from the start. So what changed? It seems More's fundamental priorities shifted. Defending religion against atheists became his top concern. And here's the kicker. Descartes' mechanistic view of the world, while revolutionary scientifically, looked increasingly suspiciously convenient for atheists. As one writer put it, it felt like it was tailor-made for the atheist purposes. Suddenly, the very system More once championed seemed to offer ammunition to his ideological opponents. This highlights how philosophical ideas could quickly become entangled with religious and political agendas. Moving on to two towering figures, Spinoza and Leibniz. Both were profoundly shaped by Descartes, yet neither fits neatly into the simple categories of Cartesian or anti-Cartesian. Their relationship with Descartes is far more nuanced, almost ambivalent. Despite their huge differences in philosophical goals, they often found themselves agreeing on key critiques of Descartes. For example, both famously agreed that Descartes kicked off a massive problem of mind-body interaction that he himself couldn't solve. Leibniz even said Descartes gave up the struggle over this problem. More broadly, both saw the value in attempting a priori metaphysics, building knowledge from first principles, but both concluded that Descartes messed up the execution. In fact, their views on this complement each other nicely. Spinoza, in a way, felt Descartes didn't go far enough towards a unified system, while Leibniz argued the opposite, that Descartes went too far in certain directions, essentially paving the way for Spinozism. Leibniz memorably put it, Spinoza merely cultivated certain seeds in Descartes' philosophy. A fascinating image, suggesting Descartes unintentionally sowed the ground for a radically different harvest. Spinoza's ambivalence shines through in the preface to his own exposition of Descartes' principles. Lodowick Meyer wrote it, but Spinoza gave it his blessing. On one hand, Meyer lavishes praise on Descartes, calling him the brightest star of our age, the one who uncovered firm foundations for philosophy. It sounds like total admiration. But then comes the caveat. Meyer explicitly states that Spinoza disagrees with many of Descartes' doctrines. One key example, free will. Spinoza couldn't accept Descartes' commitment to a faculty of free will separate from the intellect. So why the inconsistency? Meyer suggests Spinoza saw Descartes as failing to follow his own principles logically, but not because of philosophical weakness, but due to theological politics. Spinoza accused Descartes of being scared to fully embrace the implications of his own ideas if they clashed with church doctrine. He made concessions, Meyer argues, to accommodate traditional Christian beliefs about God, freedom, and immortality. Think about the substance definition implying only God exists, but Descartes hesitated to draw that conclusion fully. Or the mind-body dualism which Spinoza saw as incoherent, adopted specifically to leave room for free will and immortality. For Spinoza, sticking to the logical thread would have inevitably led not to Cartesian dualism, but to his own naturalistic metaphysics. Leibniz's critique takes a slightly different turn, heavily influenced by his awareness of Spinoza and the perceived threat of Spinozism. While he doesn't question Descartes' sincerity, Leibniz focuses on the unintended consequences of Descartes' principles. He accuses Descartes of embracing ideas that lead to strange Spinozistic outcomes. We've already touched on the substance definition, potentially implying monism. Leibniz also highlights how Descartes' decision to banish final causes from physics, explanations involving purpose or design, inadvertently cleared the path for Spinoza's complete rejection of teleology. Leibniz even goes out of his way to connect Descartes to Spinoza, quoting an obscure passage from the Principles where Descartes says, "Matter assumes successively all the forms of which it is capable." Leibniz practically shudders, calling it a dangerous proposition that leads directly to Spinoza's conclusions about the possibility of anything happening. Of course, Descartes could have retorted, "Hey, I'm just explaining the principle of plenitude, something Aristotle talked about. If accepting this makes me a Spinozist, I'm in good company." But Leibniz wasn't buying it. Beyond the Spinozist comparisons, Leibniz's critique strongly echoes Huguet's, particularly his admiration for the censura. Like Huguet, Leibniz attacks Descartes' claims to originality. First, he argues Descartes borrowed far more than he admitted, meticulously cataloging these unacknowledged debts, sometimes even seeing Descartes as a kind of wayward Platonist. Second, Leibniz dismantles the core components Descartes used to justify his originality. His rules of method, Leibniz mocks them as vacuous, famously comparing them to a chemist's advice. Take what you need, do what you should, and you will get what you want, utterly useless. And Descartes' criterion of truth, whatever I clearly and distinctly perceive is true. Leibniz points out this is circular unless you provide independent criteria for what counts as clear and distinct perception, which Descartes never did. Adding a personal touch, Leibniz also criticizes Descartes' ambition to become the leader of a sect, hinting at arrogance. Even Leibniz's critique of Cartesian physics, pointing out errors in Descartes' laws of impact, serves as a commentary on the method. If the method yields bad results in physics, how reliable can it be? Leibniz's critique was incredibly thorough, covering everything from metaphysics to methodology to physics. No wonder committed Cartesians like Regis accused him of trying to build his own reputation on the ruins of Descartes. But Leibniz wasn't entirely negative. He famously called Descartes' philosophy the antechamber of truth. What does that mean? It suggests a grudging respect, perhaps focusing on elements he could sympathize with, like Descartes' attempts at natural theology proving God's existence and the immateriality of the soul, even if Leibniz found these proofs flawed. In many ways, Leibniz is actively engaged in creatively reinterpreting Cartesian ideas, trying to salvage or redirect concepts like innate ideas and the idea that the mind is always thinking. It's less about tearing down and more about building something new from the foundations, albeit foundations Leibniz believed were shaky. Finally, let's consider John Locke. His initial encounter with Descartes was apparently quite positive. Lady Mesham noted that Locke found Descartes intelligible, which was encouraging after struggling with others. But like Spinoza and Leibniz, Locke's attitude was complex. He saw Descartes as a liberator, freeing minds from the dense, often obscure doctrines of Aristotle and the scholastics. However, he also saw Descartes as a dogmatist, And for Locke, dogmatism was almost as much of a barrier to progress as the very scholasticism Descartes fought against. Here's where Locke diverges significantly from critics like Hewitt. While Hewitt mixes philosophical points about reason's limits with personal attacks on Descartes' arrogance, Locke frames dogmatism primarily as a philosophical error, a mistaken belief about what human reason can achieve. Think about the mind-body problem. Locke isn't just saying Descartes was wrong, he's suggesting Descartes wrongly assumed human reason must have the answers. Furthermore, Locke seems less concerned with the theological implications that plagued Catholic critics like Hewitt. As a Protestant, and perhaps reflecting a latitudinarian spirit, Locke avoids the sectarian attacks. Instead, he implicitly accepts Descartes as the father of modern philosophy, shifting focus towards the theory of mind, the novel of the soul, as Voltaire later phrased it, rather than just the science of nature. This emphasis on the mind, and the critique of dogmatism as a philosophical flaw, marks a significant shift in how Descartes was received, paving the way for the Enlightenment. So, after all these intense debates, criticisms, and shifts in allegiance, what happened to Cartesianism itself? By the mid-18th century, particularly in France, a remarkable transformation occurred. Cartesianism went from being persecuted and banned to becoming an accepted, even protected, part of the intellectual landscape. It had moved from opposition to power. This shift was riddled with irony. Consider the Sorbonne, the heart of French Catholic academia. Just a century earlier, they were attacking innate ideas as remnants of scholasticism. By 1751, they were defending them against the empiricism of Locke, a complete 180-degree reversal. Voltaire himself noted the absurdity. Descartes was being embraced by the establishment, precisely at the moment his physics was being rendered obsolete by Newton. He quipped, "What a revolution!" The philosophy of Descartes was proscribed in France while it had some appearance of truth, and its ingenious hypotheses were not given the lie by experience, and now that our eyes demonstrate its errors, it will not be allowed to abandon them. Why this change? Two factors stand out. First, efforts were made to legitimize Descartes by linking him to Augustine, appealing to a non-scholastic Christian philosophical tradition. Second, by the 18th century, other alternatives like Hobbes, Spinoza, and even Locke's openness to thinking matter looked increasingly problematic to conservatives. Descartes, despite his flaws, seemed like the least bad option. But as Voltaire wryly observed, by then it was really too late. The philosophical tide had already turned.